Well, it's been a decade since Islamic terror group ISIS beheaded American-Israeli journalist Steven Sotloff, whom they kidnapped. Who would have thought that a decade later we would still be facing the same barbarism both from ISIS and from regimes like the Islamic Republic, along with all its proxies, including Hamas. As Israel mourns the brutal execution of 6 of our hostages, here with us to discuss the threat of Islamist terror is Felice Friedson, who was a close friend of Steven Sotloff. Felice, I want to thank you for joining us today in these difficult days. To start, can you tell us about Steven? Who was he? What was his story? And ultimately, what happened to him?
Well, thank you for having me, Emily. And I have to tell you, it's really bittersweet. On a day when you see that Hersh Goldberg Poland is being laid to rest, I think back to that decade ago, that brutal execution, the beheading of Steven Sotloff. He came to us at the Media Line in 2009, a courageous, bright young man who spoke Arabic. He was a dual citizen, the United States and Israel, and he was going throughout the region. 2009, I did not hire him. I was afraid he'd get killed. 3 years later, he had studied the region. He had gone to the region. He had been everywhere from Libya to Bahrain and Syria and Yemen. He was telling the world about what happened, what was going to go happening in relationship to Al-Qaeda and to the jihadist terrorist groups and relationship to what went down with ISIS. ISIS hadn't even really had a name of ISIS at that point. I think that it is so important to understand that he was there to document the history of what was happening in the region. And we witness today that not much has changed. ISIS is back, and back in quite a big way.
You know, it has been 10 years since his tragic murder, and ISIS does remain a threat, but unfortunately, they're not the only one. Why do you think we're seeing an increase in these Islamist radical terror groups who are committing these heinous acts, as we saw this week with Hamas or 10 years ago with Steven?
They know they can get away with brutal tactics. They right now also have the capability of using the net in a vast capacity in multiple languages to reach people who want to join these terrorist organizations. And they're doing it well. I think that it's very hard for the intelligence agencies to keep up with the kind of network that they have created. If you look at Yahya Sinwar, if you look at the fact that Israel has not isolated him yet, maybe they do know where he is. Maybe they can get to him, maybe they can't. But this is what you have in terms of terrorist leaders that come and go all over these countries. And look at Libya right now. We just wrote a story on Libya on the fact that Libya could be facing a revolution. No one's even looking at this country because there's so much turmoil elsewhere. If we look at what's happening from the Houthis in Yemen, no one would have even understood or thought who a Houthi was, let alone how they've disrupted the entire Red Sea and all the shipping, that the industry itself at large is creating havoc amongst the world. That is critical for economy, and it's vital for the entire world to clamp down on what's happening and to understand these assets.
I think there's been somewhat of a misperception that the conflict is about Israel, when in fact it's not actually about Israel, as we see by this pattern of behavior. I think there's also been a bit of a reluctance to attribute some of the savagery from these terrorist groups that we've seen in the West due to fear of being labeled Islamophobic. I'm wondering if you have a take on this. Is there a reasonable approach to this? Does it prevent a true understanding of the risks of these groups when the discussion is shut down, with accusations of Islamophobia?
I think that people can't fear today the labels that are existing. They have to come forward and speak out about the acts that are taking place. I think part of it is to shut down the public from coming forward and being able to discuss these atrocities. When you have somebody beheaded in front of the world, and today most people don't even know who Steven Sotloff is, let alone James Foley, 10 years later, something is very wrong if we can't address the fact that there's barbaric acts committed every day, and the fact that we have these groups totally creating havoc in the world. So we have to call out what's happening, and the intelligence agencies have to be strong, and the governments can't be held hostage by these groups. And that's part of what we're seeing as well. They can't placate terrorists. They need to be able to have all kinds of checks and balances on what we're seeing happening, whether it's drug trafficking, whether it's slavery, which is happening too, because they are taking people against their will, and some of these people are not capable of responding. So quite frankly, Emily, I think the only action here is strong action and strong words against what exists today on a very global scale, whether it's Latin America, Europe, Africa, or the Middle East. And let's not forget the streets in the United States. We can't leave that out.
Absolutely, and the campuses, even the campuses. Well, Felice, we are out of time, but I want to thank you for joining us today and, of course, for reminding us of Steven's story and his tragic accident that happened.
Thank you. Thank you very much.